Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and I'm presenting to you the lecture that you should have received or heard and seen live at Preston Victoria, but unfortunately, as you all know, the internet connection was not stable enough for me to give a presentation. So Evan and Stephen asked me to record my lecture and send it out through Evan to all of the people who attended the lecture. And I do believe that the lecture that I'm giving is very timely. It is about aliens, UFOs, government, military knowledge of the same. And it has direct relevance and direct bearing to what's going on right now on the surface. This blatant effort to subjugate the human race, turn us against each other, mistrust one another, habituate us and condition us to not want to have any physical contact or even be in close proximity to other humans. We humans are by nature social beings. It is an innate part of our character that we want to be around those that we like and care about and love. And this effort at saving us is conditioning us to mistrust one another, to keep our social distance, etc., etc. I would argue that this is a non-human agenda, and that is why this lecture that I'm going to give right now is very timely. So without any further ado, let me screen share with you the lecture that I'm going to give, the PowerPoint presentation. This is my show, The Cosmic Switchboard, and I do a number of commentaries, have recorded a number of commentaries about a variety of topics. YouTube seems to take delight in taking down and banishing my commentaries. I've also interviewed some of the top investigators and researchers in a number of fields. And you can go to thecosmicswitchboard.com and peruse the many interviews and commentaries there. And, just pick and choose subject matter that you will find interesting. Okay. The subject matter is key alien and UFO encounters in modern history. Inner nuances and lessons learned from ET experiences and close-range UFO sightings. The main topics and themes: physiological, electromagnetic, radiological, psychic, and other effects on human percipients and human technology. Eyewitness testimony of the capabilities of aliens and alien technology. And milestone events, alien encounters, and close UFO encounters. You will see recurring themes during my presentation about physiological, electromagnetic, radiological, psychic, and other effects on human percipients and human technology. Those themes will weave in and out of this lecture. Indeed, the close encounters that I'm going to focus on in this presentation are the following. And there are others who would argue that, well, I should have included such and such case. I should have talked more about some other case that others feel are more important than the ones I'm going to share with you. But I've chosen these experiences, these encounters, for a specific purpose, because they fit the criteria that I had in mind for this presentation. Antonio Vias Boas, Brazil, 1957, an absolute classic in the field. Officer Herbert Schirmer, 1967, another classic in my view. Betty Andreasson Luca, multiple encounters. Mona Stafford, Elaine Thomas, Louise Smith, Liberty, Kentucky, 1976. And the Cash-Landrum incident, December 1980. Antonio Vias Boas. He was a young man in his early 20s. in Brazil, and his incident occurred on October 16th, 1957. He was working his family farm. He was riding a tractor, and because of the heat and humidity in Brazil, Boas normally worked in the wee hours, normally did the farm work in the wee hours, after midnight, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., etc. And just the week before, Antonio Villas-Boas had seen some strange lights in the sky, UFOs, if you will. And so October 16th, 1957 rolls around. About 3 a.m. in the morning, he is riding his tractor doing farm work when out of the sky descended this lighted object. And as it came closer to a landing, the motor, the engine of Villas-Boas' tractor cut out again. Effects on the machinery, the technology of human beings. This craft lands not too far from where Antonio Villas-Boas sat on the tractor. A few aliens stepped out of it wearing helmets, and they went over and accosted Villas-Boas and brought him inside the craft, where they subjected him to what he regarded as a medical examination. They spread this liquid over his whole body, and they left him alone in a room after a while. He was in there alone and then wondering, what the hell is going on. Eventually, a female being stepped into the room, and he described the being, the female, as having the most perfect body, a female body he'd ever seen before. And it's been speculated that whether it was the liquid that was applied to his body, or perhaps because something he was made to ingest, or just natural arousal, whatever the case may be, Antonio Villas-Boas found himself highly aroused at the sight of this female alien, and the female alien was quite forward in letting Villas-Boas know that she wanted to have intercourse with him. Long story short, they had intercourse twice, if memory serves. And after the second sexual intercourse encounter, the woman got up and went to leave. She pointed to her belly, pointed to the sky, smiled, and walked out. A little while later, the other ETs came by, and they proceeded to give Antonio Villas-Boas a guided tour around the craft. And then they returned him to his field, and then they flew away. Now, Antonio Villas-Boas went and told people about this experience, and he was, quite perturbed by it, as you might understand. He then began to have side effects from this encounter: nausea, extreme thirst, aches all over his body, fevers. He was then sought out by this individual, Dr. Olavo Fontes, one of the great UFO researchers of all time, a Brazilian. And he talked with Villas-Boas about his encounter with this female being and other aspects of this UFO incident. And Dr. Olavo Fontes came away feeling that this was a legitimate experience, that Villas-Boas really did experience what he had described, that he was not lying, and he was not trying to fabricate a hoax. Not surprisingly, to this day, and myself included, many serious students of ufology, many serious UFO researchers, not those blinded or hindered by biases and whatever other shortcomings. But real serious researchers regard the Antonio Villas-Boas encounter as a classic in the field. And as many of us who do this research know, this concept of alien interest in human reproduction, human sexuality, etc., is a constant theme. And this goes back into antiquity, when people study the fairy folklore, the fairy faith, the stories about elves and other beings, and you go back to ancient mythology, Greek mythology, etc., these beings, these otherworldly beings, these aliens, if you will, these gods and these demigods, had a preoccupation with intercourse with humans, particularly human females, but also with human males. So that's the Antonio Villas-Boas encounter. And to me, one of the important aspects of this case was not only the intercourse with the female being, but also, again, the after effects, the nausea, the extreme thirst, the aches all over the body, the fevers. Some people made the comment, kind of unkind if you ask me, but they likened what Antonio Villas-Boas experienced after the encounter as a form of like space clap or something, that he has this encounter with his female and then all this stuff happens. But that may not have been the only reason why he had these symptoms afterwards. It could have been exposure to the energy fields emitted by the craft. It could have been the liquid that was spread out over his epidermis. One can only speculate. Officer Herbert Schirmer, this was another classic case. This was in Ashland, Nebraska, December 3rd, 1967. Herbert Schirmer was a patrolman for the state of Nebraska, a former Navy veteran. And he was driving his patrol car one night when he came across a landed UFO in the middle of the road. As he approached this craft, he actually thought it was a stalled big rig, a stalled truck, 18-wheeler, as they say in America, that was paradoxically blocking the road, parking itself like lengthwise across the width of the road. So Officer Herbert Schirmer obviously thought, okay, there's something wrong here, right? And as he approached this craft in his patrol car, the craft suddenly shot up into the air and disappeared. He went back to his station. Well, first he tried to call the station, and this all came out under regression later on, that he tried to call Wahoo, the base where he was stationed at, and he couldn't get through because of static, again, electromagnetic interference. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the craft flies away, and Herbert Schirmer goes back to his police station and writes in his journal, "Saw a UFO, believe it or not," and I'm paraphrasing. Well, he began to have nightmares, he began to have sleep disorders, and he began to suffer what some people would regard as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Eventually, he sought help, and Leo Sprinkle, the well-known UFO researcher and hypnotherapist, regressed Officer Herbert Schirmer, and out of him came a remarkable story. And this has happened many times in the past, and in years subsequent to Herbert Schirmer's encounter, where people see a UFO relatively close range, or sometimes very close range, and then their only conscious memory is the craft backing away and then flying away, and that's the end of the sighting, and that's the extent of the encounter. That's what these people think. That's the memory they're left with. They see a ship, and then they see the ship depart, but they don't know that something had happened in the meantime. Well, that was the case with Officer Herbert Schirmer because he was regressed. Turned out he had a period of missing time. What happened was a ramp opened up on the side of the craft, and these beings stepped out of it. One of them pulled out like this rod-like or pistol-like device, aimed it at Herbert Schirmer in the patrol car, and it shot out this glowing gaseous substance which surrounded the whole vehicle, the whole car. Then he went to the driver's window, and Officer Herbert Schirmer was looking out at him, and the entity asked him telepathically, "Are you the watchman of this place?" Apparently, there was a power plant nearby. And then the being reached over and gave Herbert Schirmer what some would liken to a Vulcan neck grip. It grabbed him in the neck area and squeezed him, and then he passed out in pain. And then the next thing he remembers is being led onto the craft. And this is the commander of the craft. Interesting that he has an antenna-looking device on its left ear. There was a rather prominent serpent symbol on the chest of this entity. And he noted the eyes. He thought the eyes were very unusual because the pupils kept dilating, getting bigger and smaller. And he likened it to like a camera lens, zooming in and out, right? And this being spoke to him telepathically. They gave him a tour of the ship, described the propulsion system to him, showed him the propulsion system, the drive system, told him it was based on reverse electromagnetism. They told him that, and they gave him a demonstration of how they can tap electricity out of a power line, because they took him for a short trip. And through a TV monitoring screen, or something like a TV monitoring screen, Schirmer was able to see this extension or an antenna-like device extend out of the side of the craft, come near the high-tension wires, and extract electricity out of it. This entity, and it was talking to Schirmer telepathically, told him that they use this excess energy they draw out from power lines and power stations. And one of the purposes behind drawing this energy is when they land, they throw a force field around the craft. And they told him that although the entity didn't use the term infrasonics, it did say that they're able to put out an energy that when people come near the landed craft, they get this feeling of high anxiety, fear, trepidation, and then just want to leave the area as soon as possible. It's a form of a defense system. Interesting that a number of creatures, cryptids, do have an infrasonic capability. Certainly some of the Sasquatch do have the ability to put out a certain fear vibe that engenders extreme fear and anxiety in people. And during the course of this tour on board the craft, the entity told Herbert Schirmer, Patrolman Herbert Schirmer, that they're from the Zeta Reticuli system. We've heard that before. And I'm sure there's more than one race that comes from that part of the galaxy. Bob Lazar interacted with beings, or not interacted with beings, rather. Although there's some who claim that he had an encounter or seen a small ET at S4, whole other story. But point of relevance is the sport model craft that Bob Lazar worked on apparently was provided or somehow obtained from beings from Zeta Reticuli, a star system, which is a binary star system. Also, the intuitive communicator Sherman, I think his last name was. He was on Project Camelot, and Dan Sherman, I think his name was. He talks about how the two ETs that he eventually learned how to communicate with, it was a long training process, but eventually, and it turned out that Sherman was groomed even before birth to be a hybrid, if you will, through a advanced ET genetic program to literally be born into the project. So eventually he could be in Air Force Security Service and become an IC, an intuitive communicator, telepathically communicating with Zetas, beings from Zeta Reticuli. Point of relevance is this being claimed to have come from, this crew claimed to have come from Zeta Reticuli. Which of the stars, I don't know. It's a binary star system. During the tour, they showed a number of TV screens, what we would call TV screens. And each screen showed something different. One screen showed a formation of ships, presumably from the same civilization as this commander. And another screen would show different star constellations. Another screen would show the ET guards that were positioned outside, that were walking back and forth. As Schirmer describes it, they were walking in a stiff, very military fashion, walking as if they've been in the military for like 30 years, is the way he likened it. And the commander also told them Schirmer, some interesting things that, well, they're going to visit him a couple of more times, at least 2 or 3 more times. And that there was something offshore, something off the shore of southern Florida, presumably in the direction of the Bahamas. He said that there was a big operation there, and I'm paraphrasing here. Something really big was going on there that was of benefit to both his civilization and to Earth people, although he didn't specify. Curious that that area that he described, we know it as the Bermuda Triangle. He also said something that was interesting, that some of the radar systems used by the military in America was having an effect on the navigation systems of some of their craft, causing them to lose their navigational guidance system. What's interesting is there is an FBI memo that talks about a very powerful radar system in the American Southwest Desert, which has been seen as the cause for causing one or more alien craft to lose its stability in flight and crash land. Scott Ramsey, who wrote the book UFO Crash at Aztec, is satisfied that he found the site for this very powerful radar station, which may have caused the large saucer to crash in Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948. Point of relevance was, fast forward to 67, here's this ET telling Herbert Schirmer that, yes, there's something about your radar that's having an effect on the navigation systems of some of our ships. And he used, the captain here, the commander, used the term ionization. So the Herbert Schirmer case is very interesting. He went through a lot of ridicule, a lot of harassment. His car was blown up, right? So I still consider the Herbert Schirmer case to be one of the top UFO encounter cases of all time.
Now we're going to talk about one of the most important cases, in my view, the Betty Andreasson Luca case, along with her husband, Robert Luca. This was a seminal series of events that lasted throughout Betty's life, and her daughter, Becky, became involved. And I'm going to share, once again, the PowerPoint. Betty Andreasson Luca, a devout Christian, photographic memory, and a very skilled artist. And it's a good thing because she was able to draw things which she had experienced, which otherwise would have defied normal verbal description. Her case is one of the most important there is, in my view, because it gives us keen insight into a particular alien culture. There's two ET races in particular in her experiences that she's seen the most of. One is this gray faction, the large bulbous heads, the big wraparound eyes, teardrop-shaped eyes, which are really eyepieces, coverings. And also this taller, human-looking race, upwards of 7 feet tall, Caucasian, long flowing hair, white hair or blonde hair, oftentimes wearing a gown. And these are described as elders. Now, Betty's experiences happened during childhood all the way up. And the books to read about her story are The Andreasson Affair, Andreasson Affair Phase 2, The Watchers, and Watchers 2. And the lead investigator in her case was Raymond E. Fowler, who himself is an alien abductee and an outstanding investigator. He is a former member of the, if memory serves, Air Force Security Service. He also worked for Sylvania on working on the electronics for ICBMs with nuclear warheads. This is an experience in 1967 in, memory serves, Ashburnham, Massachusetts. Again, the metaphysical capabilities of these beings. She saw this being enter through the front door, and it came through in phases. She drew it here, where it didn't come in all as one integrated entity. It came in almost in a ghostly pattern, except parts of it, or you can see from the illustration, I mean, words fail me at the moment, but you get the impression of what this being was capable of doing. They told her at one point that the reason they're able to go through solid objects is because matter, as we understand it, is very loose. The atoms and the molecules that make up solid matter are very loose, and it's just a question of altering their density, altering their frequency, that allows them to pass through objects. This is an example of Betty's ETs coming to the rescue, which shows that there is some degree of conflict between the various ET races. In this case, it was another faction of the so-called ubiquitous Greys that abducted Betty Andreasson Luca and her husband, Bob Luca, when they were at a drive-in theater in America. They were abducted by this other group of Greys. Her regular group of Greys that she interacts with a lot knew this was happening. They interceded, they intervened, and you can see that tall, human-looking being in the middle there. That's one of the elders. They came and they banished the other Greys and rescued Bob and Betty Luca. And the reason the books, the third and the fourth books were called The Watchers was because Betty was on board a craft on an occasion, and this gray being, she was in a part of the craft that reminded her kind of like a greenhouse or a arboreum, if you will, where there was all these plants all over the place. And this gray being was looking at one of these plants, and Betty asked her what the being was doing. And the being, the gray, told her they collect every seed and every plant on Earth, and many people have observed this. Excuse me, they've observed grays in particular collecting plant samples. And this gray told Betty that not only do they collect these plants and seeds, but they watch over the affairs of mankind and the planet, and they refer to themselves as the Watchers. And that's where the term came for the second and the third book. They also told her that the human race will eventually become sterile and will not be able to reproduce. And we're already seeing that in the so-called developed world, particularly America. We're already seeing what amounts to zero population growth because of the malign influence of the allopathic medicine, the toxic foods, all of the things that basically attack the human reproductive system for men and women. And now there's this headlong rush towards transhumanism and the whole gender confusion agenda, confusing things even more. All of that is designed to, among other things, reduce the Earth's population. And we know that there is a well-documented, boasted about, if you will, depopulation agenda. And so these beings told Betty, and again, one always has to take with a grain of salt what any being presenting itself to be friendly or otherwise tells us, right? I've had discussions with beings before, especially the reptilians. Once you get past, you have to sit through all the insults and all the threats and whatnot. And after you get through that, about 40, 50 seconds worth, a minute or more, and then they start to tell you things. But then you have to take with a grain of salt what they're telling you. In the case of the reptilians, sometimes in their arrogance and their utter disdain for humans, I'm talking about the negative reptilian factions, they will actually sometimes tell you the truth of what they're doing and what their agenda is. In this case, Betty was told by the gray in that greenhouse part of the craft that they've also, besides collecting every variety of plant matter, they've also been collecting, this particular faction has been collecting human genetic material, ovum and sperm and other forms of manifestations of DNA, if you will. Because they say at some point the human race will become sterile and will not be able to reproduce. The implication being that they're doing this for humanity's good, but again, you have to take that with a grain of salt. Maybe, maybe not. These beings have their own agendas, and it may not be in consonance with our agenda of survival and of going back, heading out into the stars. The next case I want to share with you is a very important case. It's the Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, and Elaine Thomas abduction in Kentucky, January 6, 1976. And this was a key abduction experience because not only did 3 women endure the same abduction experience, or at any rate, endure an abduction experience with the same ET captors, there were eyewitnesses to the event. They didn't actually see the abduction take place, but they saw a craft in the exact same locale where this abduction took place. So once again, I'll do a screen share here. Liberty, Kentucky abduction, Mona Stafford, Elaine Thomas, Louise Smith, January 6, 1976. And you can get a lot of information about this on the UFOinsight.com website. And this occurred January 6, 1976. It was Louise Thomas, it was Mona Stafford's birthday. And she wanted to celebrate with her two friends, Elaine Thomas and Louise Smith. So they went to a restaurant called the Redwood Restaurant in Lancaster, Kentucky, about a 45-minute drive from their hometown of Liberty, Kentucky. So they went to this restaurant and dined. They didn't drink any alcohol, and they stayed till about 11 p.m., and then they decided to drive home. It would have been a 45-minute drive. So right around 11:15 p.m. on 6 January 1976, these three women drove back to Liberty, Kentucky, and they were driving along Highway 78 in Kentucky. And during the drive back, the three women noticed a strange object in the sky glowing a bright red color. At first, Mona thought that the object was a plane that was about to crash. As the object came closer, each could clearly make it out to be a metallic gray disc with a glowing dome on top. A line of red lights moved around the middle of the disc, while further red and yellow lights emerged from the underside. And there was also the presence of a bluish beam which emanated from the bottom of the craft. As the object got closer to the car, Louise discovered she no longer had control of the vehicle, which was now moving rapidly down the road at over 80 miles per hour. Mona was sitting in the passenger seat. She tried to reach over and gain control of the vehicle to help Louisa gain control of the car. However, the steering wheel remained locked, and the speed of the vehicle continued on about 85 miles per hour, which is quite fast. The craft followed them, above them. At one point, a blue beam shined inside the car, illuminating the interior of the craft with a pale blue light. And Louise would later recall that the vehicle began to fill with a haze-like air, a sort of fog. And this has also been described by other eyewitnesses in UFO alien encounters. Shortly after, each woman began to feel an intense burning sensation and pain in their heads. A bump, quote unquote, momentarily stopped the car before it was pulled back viciously, and then they blacked out. The next thing they knew, they were back on a quiet road with a car in motion heading towards Liberty, Kentucky. Each of them recalled the encounter with the UFO, but not how they arrived at their current position in a moving car going down the road in the direction of their intended destination, heading back home to their hometown of Liberty, Kentucky. They could still feel the burning sensation on their bodies, and each woman was agitated, confused, and frightened, as you can well imagine. When they stepped inside the house, Louise Smith's house, they realized that their 45-minute journey, what should have been a 45-minute journey, had taken over 2 hours, which meant that they had about 80 minutes of missing time. 80 minutes of missing time, which they could not account for. They contacted local police, and they contacted the local Navy recruiting station. And for whatever reason, the naval recruiting station contacted the media, and that's how their case became well known. A number of UFO researchers contacted them, including Jerry Black of the Mutual UFO Network, who conducted a preliminary investigation with them. The women were first reluctant to talk about their experience, as you can imagine, because they were still suffering the after effects, the shock of the experience. It had just happened. It was fresh to them. There's Mona Stafford giving an interview years later after her two friends, Elaine Thomas and Louise Smith, had passed away. That's a sketch of the craft. You can see the size of it pulling the vehicle up into the air. Now, Jerry Black, the UFO researcher, wanted to do a hypnotic regression with them, but circumstances being what they were, their state of being, their state of mind, they didn't want to go through with it at that time. But Jerry did manage to interview them. And there was interesting information that Jerry had managed to obtain from the three women, even without the benefit of hypnotic regression. All of the women had eye infections from the burning they had felt in the car. This is going to be a recurring theme again in this lecture, how sometimes when one gets in close proximity of a hovering, flying, landed UFO, they suffer these radiological effects, radiation poisoning, for lack of a better term. So they suffered eye infections from the burning heat sensation they had felt in the car when this craft was following them, flying directly above their car. Louise had a $50 size pink-gray mark on the back of her neck. One of my dear friends, she's since passed away, Donna Hendershot, she's had a lot of MyLab experience. She had a lot of MyLab and alien experiences when she lived. In fact, she and I had shared experiences together. We used to have group abductions sometimes back in the day, myself and some of my close colleagues. And after Donna and her boyfriend at the time had experienced an alien abduction, they both wound up with these big, angry-looking, reddish marks on their backs. Anyway, Louise had a $50 size pink-gray mark on the back of her neck. What was interesting also was when one of the women came home, Louise, her pet parakeet, which would usually be very happy when she came home, instead became terrified. The parakeet tried to basically escape. It was flying into the side of the cage and went berserk in a state of total panic. This parakeet did. What Jerry Black, the MUFON investigator, then did was to kind of test to see if other birds, other pet birds, would have a similar effect when Louise Smith approached them. What Jerry did was he had Louise Smith walk up to these other pet birds that were in cages, test birds, if you will, to see what the bird's reaction would be. And it was the same pretty much as her own pet parakeet. They basically went crazy. So there was something about, I'm guessing, some kind of residual energy that had latched onto Louise Smith, so that when she approached her pet parakeet, and also when she approached the later test birds, they all went crazy because the birds felt this energy or something that was in and around Louise Smith. Louise Smith also had an interesting problem with her wristwatch. It was not keeping time properly. The minute hand was moving at the pace of the second hand for some time afterwards. And in other words, the minute hand was moving along in sync with the hour hand. Like it was Mona Stafford's birthday, but it was Louisa Smith's car. So her car headlights and signal lights, indicator lights, were having problems, electrical problems after that. Eventually, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a well-known, respected UFO investigator, incidentally, if memory serves, Dr. Leo Sprinkle also hypnotically regressed the aforementioned Herbert Schirmer, the patrolman. And what came out of the regression was that when the car had experienced a bump, which was each woman's last conscious memory, it had been lifted up by some strange traction beam into the craft. Each woman was then subjected to a physical examination and each recalled their bodies held down by a force they couldn't locate. I remember a similar thing when I was abducted on one occasion where there was nothing physically restraining me on this table, and I was made to do all these involuntary movements, but there was nothing restraining me, nothing touching me. By all appearances, I was just laying on a plain-looking table. And these women described something similar, that they were held down by some invisible force. Their bodies were scanned, and they could occasionally feel an unpleasant pressure on their limbs. Each woman would also recall a strange warm liquid which was carefully applied to their face and upper body. This is similar to what Antonio Villas Boas described, where these aliens, when he was pulled on board, they applied some liquid with some kind of sponge-like material onto his. They'd stripped him naked and they rubbed this liquid all over his body. All three women would describe shadowy figures that would float or glide around them. Every now and then they would notice eyes hovering over them. Others have described that too. So this probe-like device which hovered over their bodies and scanned them. Despite the haziness of descriptions, all described these figures as humanoid with jagged hands and around 4 feet. Although they couldn't recall the content of the communication in any detail, each woman would state that the strange humanoids would use telepathy to talk to them. Mona would later further recall that she had at one point was looking down at a table. On it was a helpless woman with several creatures dressed in white examining her. She wasn't sure if it was one of her friends or even herself, who she was viewing from an out-of-body experience. Again, this has been described by other alien abductees. In the midst of an alien abduction, for whatever reason, maybe it's proximity to the aliens, maybe it's exposure to the energy fields present within the craft, sometimes these abductees describe spontaneous alien, rather out-of-body experiences inside the craft. And sometimes these abductees say when they come out of their body, the aliens actually get mad at them for doing that sometimes. And there were other witnesses who had seen what had happened, not exactly the abduction itself, but seen a low-flying object shooting a beam towards the ground, seeing a craft in the near vicinity of where all this happened. So the key points, the key takeaways from this story is the craft following these women as they drove along. Remember, they're just minding their own business. They just want to go out and celebrate Mona Stafford's birthday. So they take her to Mona's favorite restaurant, a 45-minute drive away. On the way back, instead of a 45-minute drive, it turns into over 2 hours, missing time after they had an encounter with this craft. They felt a burning sensation. Afterwards, they had inflammation in their eyes. Louise Smith had a big reddish-gray mark, and they were suffering the after effects of what seemed to be radiation poisoning. And according to some of the reports, what was interesting was I mentioned that when Louise Smith was driving, this craft had taken control of the car. She was speeding along at 85 miles an hour. She wasn't in control of the car. She had her foot off of the accelerator. And Mona Stafford from the passenger seat reached over and tried to gain control of the car, but she couldn't do anything about it either. Louise told her she's not in control. And according to some reports of this case, there was a stretch of road where this incident occurred that was a windy, curvy road. But for whatever reason, when this craft hovered over them and gained control of the car and made the car accelerate, for some reason, what should have been a curvy, windy stretch of road was a straightaway, a straight part of the road, in a part of the road where there should not have been a straight part of the road. Louise Smith, Elaine Thomas Experience, one of the classics of UFO history. The Cash-Landrum incident, Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and Colby Landrum, December 29, 1980, near Huffman, Texas. This was another example, or similar in a way, to the aforementioned case, Mona Stafford, Elaine Smith, et al., right? Those three women I just described, they were just minding their own business. They're driving home from a restaurant after celebrating their friend's birthday. And then they have this period of missing time after this close UFO encounter, which I just described, and they became very ill as a result of it, right? Similar scenario in a way. Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum and Vicky's nephew, young Colby Landrum, I believe he was about 6 years old at the time. Vicky and Betty were just driving around looking for a game of bingo. That's what they wanted to do, just drive around until they found a game of bingo somewhere and play bingo and hopefully make some money. And what happened was they're driving along near Huffman, Texas, this is outside of Houston, and they come across this large diamond-shaped craft that was hovering over the road. There was flame shooting out from the bottom of the craft. Eyewitnesses described seeing up to 23 double-rotored Chinook-type helicopters that were following or in close proximity to this craft, which seemed to be disabled, which seemed to be having navigation problems. So Betty, and I think Betty was the one that was driving, she pulls to a stop because this thing was directly above the roadway. She didn't want to drive underneath it. It was giving out this tremendously bright light. Now Betty, despite the admonitions of Vicky Landrum, gets out of the car and starts to walk towards this diamond-shaped craft. The light intensifies, it gets incredibly hot. And Betty goes back to the car. She touches the door handle and pulls her hand away because the door handle is very hot to the touch. Eventually, she makes her way back into the car and they drive back home. Betty drops off Vicky Landrum and Colby Landrum, and then Betty goes home to her house. That night, Betty and Vicky and Colby, and in particular Betty Cash, become desperately ill. Long story short, Betty comes down with cancer, her hair falls out, her eyes become extremely inflamed. She suffers extreme manifestations of radiation poisoning. Vicky Landrum and Colby Landrum, to a lesser degree, also suffered radiation poisoning. What was interesting also was a day or two after this incident, where that craft hovered over the roadway was a patch of scorched asphalt, bitumen, as you would call it here in Australia, scorched asphalt from the flame generated from the bottom of this craft. Eyewitnesses reported within a day or two, a work crew came along with a bulldozer and scooped up that part of the roadway and then repaved it. We've heard this before in certain crash sites, UFO crash sites, where after the craft, bodies, and whatever debris is taken away, then work crews will come in with earth-moving equipment, bulldozers, etc., and redo, if you will, the area. Make it even look different than what it looked like originally before the craft crash landed. Well, something like that happened here in the Cash-Landrum incident that occurred on December 29, 1980, Huffman, Texas. A work crew came along and removed the part of the road where this diamond-shaped craft hovered directly above. Again, eyewitnesses saw upwards of 23 double-rotored helos. It was suggested perhaps that these helos came from Fort Hood, Texas. Fort Hood, Texas has its own very spooky background as far as nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapon storage areas. There was even a big UFO event that happened there, similar, from what I understand, to Bentwaters and Fort Benning, Georgia, where a number of people on the Fort Hood base reservation had UFO encounters. It's been suggested, the point of relevance is all those helicopters may have come from Fort Hood. There's Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and Colby Landrum. Sadly, Betty Cash passed away. She tried to sue the U.S. government, and the defendants in the lawsuit were the U.S. government, NASA, the Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, the Air Force, just about every major federal agency you can think of that may have had something to do with this incident. Now, Betty Cash did not think that it had anything to do with aliens. She was thinking more along the lines of an experimental craft that had, lost control and for whatever reason was hovering low over this roadway. But whether it was an experimental craft, it was a recovered alien craft crewed by humans, or it was a alien craft with an alien crew that was experiencing difficulty, which these things do happen. The craft, and I talked earlier in the story about Herbert Schirmer, where he was told by the commander of that Zeta Reticuli craft and crew that some of the radars affect the navigation of some alien craft. So was it a case in the Cash-Landrum incident of an alien craft that for whatever reason it was having navigation problems and was disabled and for whatever reason was hovering low over that roadway? And as fate would have it, here comes Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and Colby Landrum looking for a game of bingo. To add insult to injury, because of the control of the media, what have you, Betty Cash suffered a lot of ridicule in the media, a lot of ridicule. On top of her hair falling out, her eyes getting all puffy, severe headaches, and all manner of illnesses, extremely painful illnesses associated with radiation poisoning. On top of that, she had to get ridiculed, made fun of her. They comments like little green men and all this stuff. I consider her to be one of the true martyrs of the UFO field and UFO history. And if there's any justice in this world, Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, Colby Landrum. And Colby Landrum is an adult now. He's since, on occasion, spoken out about his experiences. I would like to get a hold of this guy. If any of you know how to contact him, please let me know. This is still one of the most important cases in my view, because once again, radiological side effects, radiation poisoning, effects on the environment, the pavement scorched by the flame shooting out from this diamond-shaped craft, the car hot to the touch, the intense heat and the bright light manifested from this diamond-shaped craft, being trailed by 23 Chinook helicopters. Presumably on board those helicopters, at least some of them would have been troops ready to surround the craft if it landed and was immobilized, let's say. Because it could have been a case where they were following this craft in the hopes and anticipation of it settling down, crashing, or just settling down, as in the case of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, 1965. This acorn-shaped craft just slowed down and came to a stop in a creek bed in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, 1965. It could have been a similar scenario here, where they're hoping this thing either just crashes abruptly or just comes down to a stop and lands on the ground. Helicopters would descend land, disgorge troops. They would set up a perimeter, stop all unwanted citizens from entering the area, and set up a crash retrieval. Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, Colby Landrum, a tragic case by any standards. Tragic case. Okay. Again, the reason I structured this lecture the way I did was this is the kind of lecture that I would have liked to have had when I was first coming to grips with these experiences. I would have liked to have known what civilians had experienced as a result of being in close proximity to an alien craft and or being abducted by them, as the case with Mona Stafford and her two friends, the case with Herbert Schirmer, the case with Boas. Now we're delving into the more military aspects. Key military ET UFO encounters. And again, it's very subjective. Some people would say, well, why didn't you include this case? Or why didn't you include that? Everything I took into account had to do with the main themes I was talking about. Okay? And these cases fall into the main themes, the main patterns. U.S. Air Force F-86 Sabre pilots on special recon missions obtains gun camera footage of UFOs from 1953 to 1954, and I know personally the principal witness. ET UFO close surveillance of nuclear weapons production plants and nuclear weapons bases, 1948 to 1980, and they're ongoing. Mass abductions of military personnel, Fort Benning, Georgia, September 1977. I was personal friends with the primary witness of that case, who since passed away. Mansfield, Ohio Army Hilo UFO encounter, again, one of the classic cases, October 1973. The close encounter of an Army Reserve helicopter over Mansfield, Ohio with a UFO, and then the after effects of that, which is absolutely important and relative to germane to our discussion here. The UFO crash retrieval, South Haven Park, Long Island, November 24th, 1992. Craft could have been shot down, depending on your source, by a highly powerful technological development at Brookhaven National Labs, which I'll get into. Guy Kirkwood, F-86 pilot, like a lot of witnesses, endured a lot of harassment, a lot of ridicule, a lot of debunking. I knew this guy personally. One thing I know about military aviators, military pilots, naval aviators, especially the fact that once their flying career is over in the military, very often, because they want to continue flying, they wind up going into the civilian airline world, either with civilian airliners, with passenger aircraft, or cargo aircraft. Very common. And another thing about these aviators is that's all they ever talk about is planes, flying. Guy Kirkwood was an F-86 Sabre pilot. In 1954, he was part of a top secret operation. He and three of his colleagues were part of a reserve squadron. And they were pulled into this program run out of the Pentagon. The Pentagon sent someone named Colonel Peterson, who was, by Guy Kirkwood's account, an excellent flyer, an excellent pilot, but a real bastard, a real SOB, a real strict disciplinarian. And in the briefing, Guy Kirkwood and the three other pilots that were part of his reserve squadron were told that the purpose of their mission was to fly back and forth between Salt Lake City Airport, it was a civilian airport, where his reserve squadron was, Air Force reserve planes were stationed, fly back and forth between Salt Lake City and Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, because the powers that be had determined that that flight path going back and forth was a corridor, if you will, for a lot of these spaceships, a lot of these UFOs. They were having a lot of sightings there. So they came up with the idea of training a team of 4 F-86 pilots. The machine guns and other equipment were taken out of the plane and replaced with gun cameras. Colonel Peterson from the Pentagon instructed them in the maneuvers they would need to intercept the UFOs and hopefully get the gun camera footage. Ideally, they would have 2 or more planes taking footage of the same craft at the same time, so that way they get an idea, by triangulating in this fashion, they get a good idea of the size, the speed, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. That's Guy Kirkwood on the left. He went public as Mel Noel in the early 1960s. Again, this experience happened in 53, 54 time frame. For a number of months, he was part of the secret operation. That's me on the right as a young buck. That's back in my San Diego UFO Society member days. I was a member in good standing, where I got to know Guy Kirkwood very well. We went on several research trips into the Nevada desert, Little Alien out by Area 51, where we met Bob Lazar. As a matter of fact, Guy Kirkwood took me on a trip to, where was it? Thousand Oaks. Can't remember where, but it was a private civilian airport where he introduced me to the late Colonel Gordon Cooper, the astronaut. And those of you that are familiar with the research knows that Gordon Cooper was very outspoken about the reality of UFOs and aliens. And Gordon Cooper, who was the first American in space, he was a Mercury astronaut. He was good friends with this guy, Guy Kirkwood. And Colonel Gordon Cooper had been outspoken about his own UFO experiences. Anyway, there's Guy Kirkwood on the left, and there's me on the right. And when Guy Kirkwood first went public, he was known as Mel Noel. And he'd gone through intimidation, he got through harassment. The CIA had harassed him for a while. Guy was going to be part of that National Press Club conference in Washington, D.C., where, and I give credit where credit's due, Dr. Stephen, serious documentary about UFOs. CSETI guy goes around flashing lights at UFOs in the sky and hopefully gets them the flashlights back. His name escapes me for the moment because I don't like the guy, okay? But anyway, give credit where credit's due. He put together this conference at a National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where he got a number of retired military people to talk about their UFO experiences while they were in the military. Guy Kirkwood was invited to that. But the day before, Guy was going to leave to go to that conference and give his testimony. He received a phone call from an anonymous caller who told him that if he goes to that conference, while he's gone, his house is going to be burned down and he won't have a house to return to. So he didn't go, okay? There's Guy in his flying days. He later became a flight engineer with a civilian airline, a well-known civilian airline, where he also had another UFO encounter. Now, getting back to his case, flying back and forth between Salt Lake City Airport and Mountain Home Air Force Base, on 4 occasions over a span of about 4 or 5 months, they encountered formations of flying saucers. They were told prior to their, in their initial briefings, they can expect a lot of static, interference in their communications. Static being the main problem, loud static interfering with communications. They can expect that their navigation systems will be affected. They can expect that their avionics will be affected. They were told all this. So on four occasions, the first time they encountered UFOs, they didn't get any film. They shot film, but they probably didn't get any because, unfortunately for them, the cameras were set to shoot automatically when a craft was a certain distance in front of the F-86 Sabre. What Guy Kirkwood said, and you can get his testimony in this in Tim Good's excellent book, Above Top Secret, the Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. Again, in that book, Guy Kirkwood uses the pseudonym Mel Noel. Guy said, I think that the cameras were set to shoot automatically at 1,100 feet, with a craft in front of them at 1,100 feet. They were supposed to position themselves that distance somehow, and then the gun cameras automatically shoot. Now, Guy said these craft seemed to be everywhere but 1,100 feet, as if they knew that was how the cameras were calibrated, to shoot only when the craft was 1,100 feet in front of their F-86 Sabre jet. So what Guy and the other pilots said was, take it off the sights. Let us shoot the gun cameras manually. Let us trigger the cameras manually. And that's what they did. The second time they encountered UFOs, he got a lot of film, lots of film, he and the other pilots. They went on over a period of months to have two more encounters. Remember, the flying back and forth between Salt Lake City and Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, back and forth. He said every time they returned, the 4 planes were replaced with 4 new ones. And on the occasions that they did get gun camera footage of these UFOs, someone, a technician came along, removed the gun camera footage from their planes, and it was always sent somewhere else for evaluation. He reckoned Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. But he doesn't know for sure. The bottom line is they never got to see the film footage that they themselves took. It was all need to know. They did their job. They don't need to see the film footage. Now they began to get concerned. They said, okay, if the energy emitted by these craft are causing us to have all these communication difficulties, where the static is so loud we can't even talk to each other, communicate with each other on our radios, and it's messing with our navigation, it's messing with our altimeter, it's messing with everything. If the emissions or the energy from these craft are having that effect on our planes, what effect is it having on us? That's what Guy Kirkwood and the other pilots were saying. And eventually what they did was they demanded to be taken off the mission. They said, give us a Section 8 psychiatric evaluation, anything. Just get us off. Because they started to have after effects. Again, the theme of this, part of the theme, is the after effects. I know a lot of you out there have had your own ET encounters and whatnot, but it's always important to be cautious when we're dealing with craft because of the energies they emit, because of the unknown intentions of the occupants of the craft, could be malign intentions, right? Now you would think, oh, gee whiz, these 4 pilots and their it was the 4 pilots, and then they were joined by Colonel Peterson, so that would have made 5. And they were concerned about the after effects. They were concerned about what started to happen was after these missions, after they land, after these missions, even when they didn't see UFOs, they started to come apart on the ground. They started to have severe emotional, mental, psychological reactions on the ground. And they didn't want that to happen when they were in the plane, especially if they were on the plane having another encounter with these UFOs, because they didn't know what would happen. avionics are getting messed with, communications are out, navigation, everything is being messed up, altimeter, compasses, everything is being messed up when they encounter these craft. The last thing they want is to have a nervous breakdown in the plane when all these mechanical, technical issues are going on. So they started cracking up, basically. And they told their controllers, we don't want to do this anymore. Give us a Section 8. Give us a psych eval, whatever. Just get us off. And they did. Eventually, they took them off this top secret mission. Again, over a span of 4 months, if memory serves, they had 4 encounters with these craft, groups of them, not just single craft. First time, they didn't get any gun camera footage because the craft wouldn't stay in the right place in the sky, 1,100 feet in front of their craft, of their planes. But the other times, they did get a lot of gun camera footage. Now, there's an interesting sidelight to this story, too. Colonel Peterson, that hard-ass colonel from the Pentagon that was set by the Air Force to train them, he mentioned the guy Kirkwood that he's been having contact with some of these aliens. Now, this is a time, remember, look at the context in UFO history. This is the contactee era. There are people that were going around that were heavily ridiculed, especially by mainstream ufologists, nuts and bolts, lights in the sky types. Oh, they have their engineering degrees and their scientific degrees, and they want to keep everything at this lights in the sky, at arm level. It's all about the craft, not about the occupants inside the craft. It was like that for a long time in ufology because of the malign influence and the infiltration of intelligence into the UFO field. So when these people come along and said, I've been having ongoing encounters with these human-looking beings, and I would argue we look like them, they don't look like us. I mean, if they've been flying throughout the cosmos and going into other dimensions in these super advanced craft, and they happen to look human, perfectly human, I might add, more perfect than we, because a lot of times the contactees said that they didn't have a blemish, they didn't have a freckle. It was like they had figured out genetics to the point where they can make themselves look like perfected human beings. Some slight differences besides the technology, intelligence, like we can make our fingers fold over in this direction. Some of these human ETs were able naturally to make their fingers, which is kind of creepy if you ask me, bend naturally this way for whatever reason. I don't know what they'd be grabbing or whatever, or how useful that would be. But some of the contactees described that. And they also described how their faces were perfectly symmetrical. Their eyes, their mouth, everything was perfect. No freckles, no blemishes, no moles, not a hair out of place. Anyway, it seemed that Colonel Peterson had made contact with one of these beings. It's like they sought him out because they knew he was the leader of this particular unit that was going around doing these photo intercepts. And what a number of contactees have reported is that sometimes some of these human-looking ETs have invited these contactees to go away with them, to leave Earth permanently. Bye-bye. Some of these contactees took them up on it. They left, and they were never heard from again. Some people took a pass on that. No, I kind of like it here on Earth. But if you guys want to come by every once in a while, and these contactees would describe, these were not abductions, they were saying, they were invited on board the craft. They were given a tour of the craft, and we've heard this before. Herbert, Schirmer, V.S. Boas, again, you will see this information again, these recurring themes. Taken on board the craft, taken for a little trip sometimes, taken off-world sometimes, taken to another world at times, shown the inner workings of the craft, and then returned. Well, Colonel Peterson, the point of relevance is that hard-ass SOB commanders sent from the Pentagon by the Air Force, he was invited by one of these ETs to go away with them. Colonel Peterson told Guy Kirkwood, yes, I'm going to go with them. And so the epilogue of the story was, after this unit was disbanded because they insisted on being taken off the missions because they were starting to crack up, Colonel Peterson got into his plane in the east coast of America, flew out into the ocean, presumably to rendezvous with these ETs, and was never seen again. Very interesting. I feel that that whole contactee era needs to be reevaluated. And the mainstream nuts and bolts researchers of the time, oh, how silly, these beings that look perfectly human, and they give people these guided tours of craft, and they take them for a little joyride, then you set them back down again. To this day, people are still having encounters with human-looking beings all over the world, especially in places like the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Latin America. One hears a lot of these types of stories of ongoing interactions with beings that look, for all intents and purposes, human. Robert Salas, fated giant. Unfortunately, Robert Salas has joined the camp of hating Larry Warren, and I'll get more into that. Larry Warren, yet again, like Guy Kirkwood, there was a lot of mainstream researchers who thought Guy was full of it. Oh no, this story, he just made it up. He wants fame and fortune and all this other stuff. You see, the first ring of defense for the powers that be is always the UFO community. The UFO community is its own worst enemy because of the infiltration and the egos and empires involved. So rather than say, okay, Guy, let's hear your story, no, let's talk trash about Guy. Let's talk trash about Bob Lazar. Let's talk trash about Larry Warren. The guys that are actually out there risking everything to get this information out, they're the first ones to be raked over the coals, and the ones that are doing the raking, invariably, initially, is the UFO community itself. To his credit, Robert Salas initially came out with this story when this is March 1967, Malmstrom Air Force Base. UFO shut down nearly 20 nuclear missiles, known as Oscar Flight. What they do is they disperse these nuclear missile silos over hundreds and sometimes thousands of square miles in places like Montana, North Dakota. Big sky country, God's country, as the locals there will tell you. That way, if the Soviets at the time or the Russians nowadays hit one of these sites with their own nuclear or thermonuclear missiles, in theory, the other missiles dispersed far away should still be able to launch a retaliatory strike. And that's a whole other story, because there are insiders that have been saying all along that the intention was always to launch a first strike and not a retaliatory strike. Anyway, Robert Salas was in the launch control facility in one of these nuclear missile sites, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, Minutemen missiles, if memory serves, with a nuclear warhead. He was in the launch control facility, and he was called up and said, these UFOs are flying around or hovering over the nuclear missile sites. And then shortly afterwards, upwards of 20 nuclear missiles went into no-go status, what they refer to as a fated giant scenario. No-go status means that they could not launch the missiles. Now, after the craft left, they sent technicians over to take out the guidance navigation computer part of the nuclear missiles, the ICBMs, and they realized that the targeting information had been tampered with. So even if these missiles had been able to be launched, they wouldn't have went to where they were supposed to go. So March 1967, Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, UFOs shut down nearly 20 nuclear missiles. And that was not the only time this happened. And later on, unfortunately, he joined the camp of let's hate Larry Warren, because Larry Warren is one of the legitimate, most important eyewitnesses from Bentwaters, RAF Bentwaters, a Reynolds from Forest incident, December 1980. Long-standing alien interest in atomic and hydrogen bombs. That's the famous or infamous picture of Jesse Marcel, the late, great Jesse Marcel. He was a lieutenant, he was a major at the time, retired as a lieutenant colonel, and he was the first whistleblower about what we now know as Roswell. He's there in the office of the 8th Air Force commander at the time, which was the parent organization of the 509th Bomb Group based at Roswell, Walker Army Air Force Base, Walker Army Field in Roswell, New Mexico, the home of the 509th Bomb Wing, which was this known as 509th Composite Group in World War II, which was the group, the air wing that dropped the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a highly secret organization, and of all the Air Force units to recover craft, it turned out to be the 509th. Now, again, this underscores this interest that the ETs have in the nuclear weapons capability of the human race. And the picture there is the infamous picture when Jesse Marcel was ordered to pose with tin foil and balsa wood and bits of junk, which made up supposedly a recovered weather balloon. This was in the office of General Roger Ramey, 8th Air Force commander, 8th Air Force being the parent group of the 509th Bomb Wing. This picture was taken in Fort Worth, Texas. Lieutenant, at the time, Major Marcel flew in with some wreckage and presented some to General Roger Ramey and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas DuBose. Interesting, Colonel Thomas DuBose, before he died, gave a videotape deposition in which he said straight up that the weather balloon story was a cover. They really had recovered an alien craft and all that implies, including the alien bodies. So the point of relevance here is 509th Bomb Wing, same unit that nuked Japan, World War II. At the time, still in 1947, the time of Roswell, the only nuclear-armed bomb wing in the world. For whatever reason, alien craft came to grief. There was more than one retrieval, and the wreckage, the bodies, were recovered. The incident we now know as Roswell. And what a lot of people forget is the 509th Bomb Group was the world's only, at the time, nuclear-armed bomb wing. The Fort Benning incident, John Vasquez was an old friend of mine. He lived in San Diego. I knew him very well. In fact, I spent an entire weekend debriefing him about this. Were 1,300 troops abducted by ETs during a classified battle between the U.S. Army and UFOs in September 1977. Notice the date. That was 3 years and 3 months before the much more famous RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge / Rendlesham Forest incident, which I'll get to in a moment. Long story short, there was an entire battalion of 1,300 troops that were on parade formation at night at Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Benning, Georgia is the home of the U.S. Army's Advanced Infantry School. Also the home of a regiment of the Army Rangers. And they have, detachments of special forces there as well. Infantry school, think about it that way. 1,300 troops were on parade formation at night, and suddenly these UFOs descended. Many of the troops were immobilized. They were standing like statues in formation. A lot of them were not, and the ones that were able to get away ran in every direction. Some hid underneath the barracks. Didn't matter. The aliens got a hold of them, a lot of them anyway, and John was one of these. He was hiding underneath one of the barracks with some of these other soldiers, and he had a telepathic message from a being he perceived to be female talking to him. And then the inevitable happened a day or two after this event. See, what happened was this incident was so shocking that the troops that were abducted and were returned were traumatized. They fled out into the woods. and they hid there. There were groups of them, and they wouldn't come back to the base. They actually had to send out teams led by a Green Beret, Army Special Forces guy, to try to bring them back, right? But these guys didn't want to go back, understandably, because of what happened. They were just terrified and frightened. Now, we've since had a couple of other witnesses come forward. Apparently, they've gone through harassment too. Some of the information they shared online has disappeared. But they verified generally what John Vasquez talked about, that there was a mass abduction. And a number of cover stories went out to explain what happened that night. That there was a measles outbreak, so they had to quarantine the base. That there was a Jaws weapons test. There was a weapons test that took place. Now, according to some of the witnesses, there was an actual shootout. Wouldn't be the first time. Wouldn't be the last time. Actual shootout between the Army and the ETs, in which craft and apparently helicopters were shot down. And there were casualties incurred, right? So John Vasquez and a number of these people who endured this mass abduction, they went out into the woods and wouldn't come back. Eventually, they were talked into coming back. Not surprisingly, and this is par for the course, shortly thereafter, the Army psychologists and their hypodermic needles showed up. And they went around giving these hypodermic shots to all these soldiers that were part of this experience. And then using narco-hypnosis, they were made to consciously forget this experience. Sometime later, John Vasquez wakes up with a start, sits up bolt upright in bed and screams. Well, his wife asked him, what happened? What's going on? Well, he was starting to have bleed-through memories of what had happened that night in September 1977 in Fort Benning, Georgia. And then thereafter began this quest to understand what happened, to find other witnesses. I think I consider this to be one of the most important cases of all time. It was a mass abduction of 1,300 troops, or at the very least 1,300 troops were directly affected. Like I said, some were immobilized, some tried to get away, but many of them wound up becoming abducted. And that was another subtext to the Bentwaters case. It turned out that there was a number of people in the force who experienced missing time. They were abducted. There's John Vasquez. He also served a stint with the U.S. Army in Germany. Incidentally, in Germany, they brought him into his commanding officer's office where he was asked about lights in the sky. And he goes, what are you talking about? It doesn't make sense. See, they were testing to see if his memories were starting to come back. Then they sent him away. Oh, nothing. Never mind. Go back to your duties. And then later on, he had that nightmare where he sat up bolt upright in the middle of the night screaming because he was starting to have bleed through. The narco-hypnosis, the post-hypnotic suggestion to forget about this was starting to break down. There's John Vasquez talking about his experience. I'm going to talk now about another important case, the Mansfield, Ohio Army Reserve helicopter encounter with a UFO. Again, it was late at night. It was in October 1973. And the guy who was the pilot eventually retired from the Army Reserves as a lieutenant colonel. His name was Lawrence Coyne. This is one of the, again, in my view, one of the most important experiences. And let me do the screenshot again. That is an artist's rendition of the craft as it flew directly above the Army helicopter, October 18th, 1973. The crew of this helicopter were flying from Cleveland, Ohio. Well, they had come from Cleveland, Ohio. They went to another part of Ohio in order to undergo medical exams. And then on their way back, this encounter occurred. And again, this is I'm reading this from UFOinsight.com. the 1973 Mansfield-Coyne helicopter UFO incident. The incident of October 1973 over Mansfield, Ohio was witnessed by 4 professional military pilots as well as multiple witnesses on the ground. Furthermore, the encounter is still unexplained but considered one of the more authentic of such incidents. An unknown and highly advanced aircraft would zoom in on a military helicopter and then stop suddenly in front of them, hovering silently. Each of the pilots would sign sworn testimony regarding the authenticity of the encounter. Such was the conviction of what they saw. Perhaps more important was the commander of the helicopter in question chose to speak to the media before debriefing his superiors, or rather being briefed by his superiors. He would have been the one that had been debriefed, and also made the sign non-disclosure statements for sure. This, rightly or wrongly, depending on your perspective, prevented any aspect of the incident from being classified. So that's a key point to remember. Was before the pilot, Lawrence Coyne, was debriefed by his military superiors and told to shut up about the subject, and made to sign non-disclosure statements and be threatened and harassed and all that. For whatever reason, he jumped the gun and talked to the media. As the Army Reserve UH-1 helicopter cut through the night sky on 18 October 1973, events were about to become surreal. The 4-man crew, Captain Lawrence Coyne, Lieutenant Arrigo Jesse, Sergeant John Healy, and Robert Yanisak, had traveled from Cleveland to Columbus, Ohio, earlier that evening for a regular standard medical examination. Following that, they would board their vehicle at 10:30 p.m. and leave for the return journey back to Cleveland. It was while they were over Mansfield that the night took a strange turn. They were flying at 2,500 feet, and they noticed, one of the crew members noticed this light that was nearby as they're flying along. Long story short, this light then rapidly started closing on the helicopter, and it seemed to the crew members, including the pilot, that this light, this craft, was on a collision course with their helicopter. And Captain Lawrence Coyne thrust the helicopter down, descending around 500 feet. And at the same time, he's calling out to the control tower in Mansfield, Ohio, asking them if they had any traffic in the area and if they could pick up what was going on. They can pick up on the radar this craft. And again, the communications were interrupted. This comes up again and again in a lot of these cases, with whether it's car radios and police cruisers, or it's communications in a helicopter or an airplane, they get disrupted. The red object was still heading in the direction the men prepared for impact. And what was interesting was Captain Coyne, seeing that the craft was heading straight towards them, put his helicopter into a dive. But what happened was, instead of diving, the craft ascended. It ascended like a couple of thousand feet at least. Because as was the case with Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, and Elaine Thomas, this craft, this regular kind of a cigar-shaped craft, had locked onto their helicopter and pulled them upwards at a time when Captain Coyne had the control set for a crash dive to avoid the collision. Instead of diving downwards, they're being pulled upwards. And this object, and let me read more of the account here. This is very interesting. Suddenly, a green light swung from underneath and hit the windshield of the helicopter. According to Coyne, the whole cabin turned green as the light illuminated everything in a bright green color. After a few seconds, the light went out and the object moved up into the west at great speed. Coyne, who had the helicopter's height locked throughout the incident at 1,700 feet, realized they were suddenly at a height of 3,500 feet. They had climbed almost 2,000 feet in a matter of seconds and never knew it. Suddenly, a bump nudged the helicopter, and instinctively Coyne climbed slightly, the vehicle now back in his control. And we heard this bump thing in the case with Mona Stafford, Louise Smith, Elaine Thomas, where they felt a bump in their car as the craft was directly above their car, and then they blacked out and lost consciousness. In this case, they all felt the bump, and afterwards, they regained control of the craft. This is a very important case, not only because of the caliber of the witnesses, but also, and it's one of the themes we keep referring to and recurring themes in this lecture, the after effects. In this case, it wasn't so much that they had physiological after effects, radiation poisoning and whatnot, at least none that was reported. What was interesting was in the days and weeks after this encounter, Lawrence Coyne, Captain Lawrence Coyne, later retired as a lieutenant colonel, and the other members of his crew began receiving mysterious phone calls from some shadowy woo-woo individuals who were from this spooky department within the Pentagon. And these mysterious people would ask them questions like, since the encounter with the UFO, have they had dreams of body separation, i.e. out-of-body travel? And I just mentioned in the previous case, Louise Smith, Mona Stafford, Elaine Thomas, that Mona described coming out of her body during the experience and looking down and seeing what may have been her body or one of her friends on a table surrounded by these creatures. Well, this mysterious woo-woo character who called up Captain Lawrence Coyne asked him the same thing. Subsequent to this experience, since this experience, has Captain Coyne experienced any body separation, out-of-body experiences? He was also asked if he had since had any dreams about spheres or spherical shaped objects, or had any kind of dreams where he got some kind of mental telepathy, like some kind of telepathic message. And sure enough, some of the members of the crew described that yes, and subsequent to this experience in the helicopter with this craft, some of them did start to have dreams of spheres and did start to have telepathic messages in these dreams. I don't think I mentioned in the Betty Andreasson part of this lecture that one time her and her husband, Bob Luca, were abducted, astrally abducted during the day, taken right out of their body. They were dressing in their bedroom. Bob was putting on a sock. Betty was dressing up. They were prepared to go out. And then in broad daylight, the aliens astrally abducted them, left their bodies immobilized, frozen in place as they took their physical bodies away. And then they encountered these light beings who presented them things, showed them things like spheres, like geometric shapes like triangles and pyramids, but they also showed them spheres, right? So, interesting aftermath of the Mansfield helicopter, Army helicopter UFO encounter. South Haven Park, Long Island. This is, again, one of the most important cases. Long Island, New York, November 24th, 1992. Federal Firefight Guide, April 1994, second edition, contains a chapter on dealing with crashed UFOs. In particular, it highlights, underscores the dangers, the radiological dangers. Again, that recurring theme. You see, we're going to have this information come up again and again. In that chapter of the Federal Firefighting Guide, and there's a whole other story about the federal firefighters. I know a number of UFO-related cases where the local firefighters don't show up, or they're cordoned off, but the federal firefighters 60 miles away from Fort Irwin Army Base show up at a site first, right? In that firefighting guide, that chapter, it warns specifically about radiological dangers associated with crashed or disabled or landed craft, right? Keep that point in mind. South Haven Park, Long Island, New York. Now, Long Island has had a lot of UFO sightings. There's been more than one UFO crash there. The legendary researcher of the Long Island UFO Network, John Ford, as a result of his investigations, wound up becoming a political prisoner. They framed him on trumped-up charges of threatening to assassinate politicians in Long Island, and they threw him in a psychiatric ward. And it was only recently that he was released from a highly secure psychiatric ward and allowed to go to another, less secure psychiatric ward. John Ford is a political prisoner because of this and other cases. What happened, depending on who you talk to and depending on the source, the craft, either due to navigation problems or internal technological problems, came to grief and crash landed. Or, depending on your source again, it was shot down by an advanced, some kind of quark plasma gluon weapon based at Brookhaven National Labs. It was shot and blasted out of the sky. As a result of this craft being shot down or otherwise crash landing without being shot down, once again, we had radiological issues. For days after this craft crashed, once again, the authorities sealed off South Haven Park. John Ford and his team were able to get in there, and they noticed that some of the trees were burned. They had higher than normal background radiation in certain places, hot spots, if you will. And the surrounding community suffered a series of rolling brownouts, as they call them in America. Not blackouts, where it's a power outage for a while, could be, a minute, 10 minutes, an hour, 10 hours. Brownouts are like, well, what happened to the power? Oh, it came back, but it's gone again, right? So these are like rolling blackouts that move around in different parts of the communities. And that's what happened in the aftermath of this craft either being shot down or otherwise coming to grief and crash landing in South Haven Park. Now, what's interesting is someone within the federal firefighters unit that was there, it was a federal firefighting unit from Brookhaven National Lab, of all places. And these guys came there with a radiological kit. They knew what they were dealing with. One of them took video of the crash site, of the radiological fires, of the burning debris. And although you cannot see it very well in the video, apparently one or more alien bodies. This story was featured in a segment of the classic paranormal TV show on Fox years ago in America called Sightings. All serious UFO researchers waited every Friday night for a new episode of Sightings because they did segments on topics such as this. The South Haven UFO crash, whatever the cause of it, whether it was shot down or the craft came to grief through technological, mechanical malfunction, whatever the case may be, remains a landmark in the history of UFO field research. And the key investigator for that case, John Ford, has become a political prisoner of the United States. He was framed on bogus charges of wanting to assassinate several government officials in the state of New York. And the reason why they harassed him, the reason why they eventually set him up, they even went to the trouble of infiltrating his life with a fake friend to set him up, was because of the work he was doing, the research he and his team were conducting into the South Haven crash and other crashes. Mauritius Bay, I think that's how you pronounce it, Mauritius Bay, also in Long Island, was investigated by John Ford and Long Island UFO Network. And that was the crash retrieval of a large wedge-shaped object that might have been shot down also. That happened in the 1990s, if memory serves. The late, great Leonard Stringfield investigated this case. It was featured in one of his status reports about UFO crash retrievals. So Long Island was a hotspot of UFO activity. And here is a screenshot of a slide of John Ford. In the recent past, he's been moved out of a highly secure psychiatric ward because they put him in a psychiatric ward in high security. Goodness knows what they did to him in there. And it was only in the recent past that he was moved to another psychiatric facility that was not as highly secure. So hopefully it's a trend. Eventually John Ford will have his freedom. But just understand that he is a political prisoner, for lack of a better term, because of the work that he and his team were doing as far as the South Haven crash in Long Island, November, that we talked about. It was just a tragic case all the way around. And unfortunately, John Ford, he had to bear the brunt of this manipulation. That was November 24th, 1992. And again, we talked about the Federal Firefighting Guide, which came out April 1994. There was a chapter dealt specifically with crashed UFOs, and in particular the dangers of the radiological effects of crashed or landed UFOs. Now, we're going to be getting into the nuclear weapons, weapons making aspect to this, because from the dawn of at least this latest version of humanity's nuclear and thermonuclear weapons development, aliens, extraterrestrials, call them what you will, have been deeply interested in monitoring the progress of humanity's development of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. Dr. Oppenheimer was asked if the explosion of the plutonium device at the Trinity site, excuse me, that's what Oppenheimer called the site in New Mexico where they tested the first atomic weapon. I believe that was July 16th, 1945. It was the implosion plutonium device. After the war, he was asked if that was the first time that there'd ever been a nuclear explosion on Earth. And Oppenheimer said yes, in modern times, because Oppenheimer was a student of Sanskrit. He was a student of the Vedic text. He spoke Sanskrit, he read Sanskrit, and he knew from the ancient Indian sacred texts that nuclear weapons, beam weapons, if one were to put a modern spin on the descriptions in these ancient texts of the weaponry that was used in these gods of wars and men, Oppenheimer would have known that nuclear weapons had been used in the distant past, that the Trinity site explosion, July 16, 1945, was not the first time the nuclear weapons were deployed. And recently, there was a physicist who went public and said that based on evidence found on Mars, an isotope was found there, which apparently is not naturally occurring. It can only come about as a result of nuclear fission. And this physicist was postulating that it's possible that aliens, they would have been Martians, we would have been the aliens from our earthly perspective, but at any rate, these beings on Mars had engaged in nuclear warfare because the byproducts of nuclear fission were found by probes that were sent to take samples of the Martian atmosphere. So keep all that in mind. Also, before I proceed, there are places in the Middle East and places in the subcontinent where there is a layer of greenish glass-like material, which is now known as trinitite, named after the site in New Mexico, which Robert Oppenheimer called Trinity, the Trinity site. They found out that after they set off the plutonium device in New Mexico, the heat from the fireball had fused the sand and turned it into this greenish glass-like substance, hence the term trinitite. Well, they found trinitite, lots of it, in parts of the Middle East as well as places in the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, that area, suggesting that sometime in a distant past, nuclear weapons or thermonuclear weapons had been utilized there. It's not a question of who discovered nuclear fission. It's actually the capability and know-how was known to civilizations long before our own. So fast forward to World War II, the development of atomic weapons, the Manhattan Project, which culminated in the dropping of the uranium-235 device on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later, that was on August 6, 1945, and on August 9, 1945, the dropping of the plutonium device, the implosion device, over Nagasaki, known as Fat Man. The bomb was known as Fat Man. Thereafter, the United States continued to make nuclear weapons and eventually began to make thermonuclear weapons, i.e. hydrogen bombs. Well, early on, even during the days of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos in New Mexico in World War II, there were UFO sightings seen very close to Los Alamos, and then after the war in places like Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Oak Ridge National Laboratory was where the gaseous diffusion plants were set up to enrich uranium-238, actually to separate the isotope uranium-235, which was found in infinitesimal amounts within the uranium-238. And then they also would further enrich it once they separated the isotope of uranium-235 from uranium-238. They would enrich it through the use of large magnetrons, cyclotrons actually is what they were called. Dr. Henry Lawrence, the inventor of the cyclotron, he worked at Berkeley with Oppenheimer prior to World War II. He created what they called racetracks of these large cyclotrons, and it was another form of enrichment of uranium and plutonium too. Electromagnetic isotope separation is what they called it. But anyway, not only was uranium-235 produced in Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, and this was a vast operation. They actually created massive amounts of electricity by
tapping into the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a huge hydroelectric dam project in Tennessee. So that was one of the plants, along with Hanford, Washington State, where a lot of the plutonium-239 was created. And the point of relevance was, in the immediate post-war years, at least as far back as 1948, if not sooner, Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee began to have these visitations. These first, what was described as very large green fireballs would fly at high altitude, at high speed, directly over this uranium-235/plutonium-239 plant. It became such a worry to the Atomic Energy Commission, which was created after World War II, which later, after another name change, it became the Department of Energy, the DOE. It was of such concern to the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, as well as Army intelligence, Air Force intelligence, the FBI, and Naval intelligence, that they actually convened a top secret conference in Los Alamos. The investigation into these green fireballs, which were overflying places like Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was given the code name, the investigation was given the code name Project Twinkle. Dr. Lincoln La Paz was a world-renowned expert on meteorites in the University of New Mexico, and he was taken into this project to study these large green fireballs that travel at very high speed directly over these Atomic Energy Commission sites. And Dr. Lincoln La Paz stated that, in his opinion, these were not meteorites. There was something else entirely. Present at one of these gatherings to discuss these green fireballs, and we know this took place because this information was obtained via the Freedom of Information Act. In Los Alamos, a meeting was convened. The FBI was present, Air Force Intelligence, Army Intelligence, FBI, and a number of world-famous physicists were asked to take part, including Dr. Edward Teller. And then decades later, he became involved in the recruitment of Bob Lazar. That's a whole nother story. Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Incidentally, as far as the green fireballs are concerned, one of my old buddies, when I worked at my old stomping grounds, Naval Air Station, North Island. Before that, it was an Army airfield known as Rockwell Field, where, among other people, the great aviator Jimmy Doolittle learned how to fly. It was one of the places he learned how to fly. And then later on, the Navy took it over and became Naval Air Station, North Island. And over the years, many of the great Army and Navy pioneering aviators earned their wings there. One of my old buddies that worked right around the corner from me, I worked in communications at Commander Naval Air Force's U.S. Pacific Fleet. He worked at Naval Aviation Depot, just around the corner. It's a good buddy of mine. His job was, he was a director of what they call NADEP, Naval Aviation Depot. And his job was to oversee all the work done on the avionics for the FA-18 Hornet, and also for the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, the advanced warning control plane, the Navy version launched from carriers of the larger Air Force AWACS, command and control radar, advanced early warning aircraft. Anyway, my friend ran that whole department, and he was a smoker. And one morning before his shift, he was out there by the pier, out there by the water at Naval Air Station, North Island. And if you're familiar with the geography there,
just down the road, down past what they call the Silver Strand. It's like this isthmus that connects North Island with the island of Coronado. The island of Coronado is where the Navy SEALs have a big base there. Anyway, he was out at Naval Air Station North Island, over by the water, smoking a cigarette, when suddenly one of these large green fireballs, without a sound, this is early in the morning, flies right overhead at high speed and just disappears out over the Pacific Ocean. Big green fireball, go figure. Okay, in 1975, again in October, there's that window again, October, November, when all kinds of spooky UFO type stuff happens, right? Already talked about Herbert Schirmer. That was in the October, November time frame. Antonio Villas Boas, October, and then 1957. Well, in about a 3-week span, late October, early November in 1975, which was a big UFO year for me. Okay, I had all kinds of interesting dreams and would wake up with nosebleeds and had a lot of UFO and Bigfoot type dreams back then. And late October, early November 1975, the northern tier of Strategic Air Command bases in America were being visited by UFOs. Loring Air Force Base in Maine, October 1975, was a Strategic Air Command base where they kept nuclear weapons, which they loaded onto bombers, and then if war ever arose or a full-on launch was declared or ordered, they would fly off to whatever their targets were and drop their nuclear ordnance or thermonuclear ordnance. Well, Loring Air Force Base had these incursions over the weapon storage areas of nuclear weapons by UFOs. You can read all about this in the excellent book, Clear Intent, by Fawcett and Greenwood. And all the information in that book, Clear Intent, which later was republished under the name the UFO Cover-Up. Virtually all the information in that book came about as a result of the American Freedom of Information Act. We're talking actual military documents that were released by the military that came about because the military, the Air Force, etc., were petitioned by private American citizens to cough up this information. Wurtsmith Air Force Base, Michigan, another Strategic Air Command base. Nowadays, it's known as Strategic Command, and it's an all-service command nowadays. It includes the Navy, and but back then, Strategic Air Command was an Air Force command, and it was honed to a razor's edge when it was commanded for several years, 8 years, or if memory serves, or longer, by legendary Commander General Curtis LeMay, who turns the Strategic Air Command into one of the most deadly strike forces in the world. Anyway, Wurtsmith Air Force Base was another Strategic Air Command base which housed nuclear weapons. And like Loring Air Force Base, right around the same time, was visited by a number of UFOs. And like I said, oftentimes, not only would these craft fly over or hover over restricted airspace, but sometimes they'd hover right over the nuclear weapons storage facilities. Sometimes, as in the case in Bentwaters, which I'll talk about more later, they were actually beaming lights down into the weapons storage areas. Malmstrom Air Force Base, infamous in UFO annals. In 1975 also, during this 3-week period, UFOs were seen right over the nuclear missile silos. And like I stated earlier, these silos would be spread out over hundreds, if not thousands of miles of square miles of Montana and nearby states. But somehow these aliens knew exactly where they were. And I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Robert Salas and the incident he had in 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, when up to 20 nuclear missiles were rendered into no-go status, so-called fated giants. Interestingly enough, the guy that I discussed earlier, Raymond Fowler, who investigated Betty Andreasson and wrote a series of books about her, as a electrician working for Sylvania, a defense contractor, he had heard from another technician that sometimes these UFOs show up over these nuclear missile sites and they disable the warheads. They need to be fixed, the guidance computers. So Malmstrom Air Force Base in October, late October, November 1975 was visited again by UFOs. And the accounts of the eyewitnesses there, because numerous witnesses would see these UFOs. Sometimes they were quite large. In one account, it was described as a large orange, reddish, glowing craft that was roughly the shape of a football. And it was the length of a football field. And it was hovering at relatively low altitude, right over the restricted airspace and right over some of these nuclear storage facilities. They have these teams called Sabotage Alert Team, SATs, and they were freaking out, as you can imagine, because their job is to fight any kind of incursion onto the base or terrorist attack or whatever. And then here come these huge UFOs that are hovering right over missile silos or hovering right over the bases. It was a show of strength, as they say nowadays. It was a show of strength. And just as in 1967, they caused upwards of 20 nuclear missiles to go offline, to use a term we would use today, no-go status, fated giants. We've seen the inverse of that. One of the stories that came out of the old Soviet Union was one of these UFOs had hovered right over a nuclear missile silo in the Soviet Union. And instead of disabling it or shutting it down, the missile went into launch sequence. It was going into launch sequence in order to launch. And the Soviet technicians were frantic trying to prevent this from happening, this unauthorized launch. And it was the aliens that were doing this. At the last moment, either they were able to prevent the launch, or the aliens said, okay, we've had our fun. We'll stop this launch sequence now. There's even a story, and if some of the information gleaned from, which I have no reason to doubt, and not only was a lot of information obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by Fawcett, Greenwood, and other researchers, but there have been a lot of leaks from the inside, or at least people that had access to certain information, certain documentation. And the father-son team, the Woods, they wrote a book about this from a lot of the documents they obtained. It's called the Majestic Papers, I think it is. Malmstrom Air Force Base. Again, late October, November 1975. RAF Bentwaters, still one of the most important cases. The never-ending attacks on Larry Warren by all these vicious trolls, all these fraud UFO researchers like Nick Pope, and these limited hangout types like late retired Colonel Charles Halt. They never ceased their attacks on Larry Warren because Larry Warren was there at the fourth night. Turns out there were 4 nights in a row. I'd spoken with Gary Hesseltine, who's investigated this case exhaustively. I've had him on my show twice. It was commonly thought amongst UFO researchers that there were 3 nights that made up RAF Bentwaters / the Rendlesham Forest incident or incidences. Turns out that there were 4 nights in a row. And Larry was at the last night. He'd just come back from leave in Holland. I think he went to Amsterdam somewhere. And then he came back after leave, and then shortly after coming back, he went onto the duty roster. And he had the night shift. And it was late at night when all this stuff happened. Long story short, some of you are familiar with the story, I'm sure. But Larry was one of a number of people that were in a clearing in the forest where they encountered not only a landed UFO, but occupants came out of the craft too. They came out in an orb or orbs, and these little beings were inside the orbs. And as was the case with some of the other witnesses I've talked about in this lecture, Mona Stafford, Elaine Thomas, Louise Smith, Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, Larry Warren, and others that were present at the last night of events in Rendlesham Forest suffered radiological radiation poisoning. Larry Warren had retina burns from the bright flash of this red object that hovered over this glowing mist in this clearing. Bright flash, soundless explosion, searing brightness, suffered retina burns. And then after the light dissipated and his vision came back, there was a structured craft that was sitting there on the ground. And it must be remembered, folks, that this concept of landed craft, occupants seen outside of the craft, occupants seen to come out of the landed craft, that is well embedded in the study of UFOs. There's nothing unusual about it. There's been many people, particularly law enforcement people and military people, who've seen this. And your average Joe or Julie citizen has seen this as well. Landed craft, beings coming out of the craft. What differentiated Warren's story compared to some of the others is, first of all, his experience happened on the last night, whereas others that have come to be known as being involved in RAF Bentwaters, their experiences occurred in the previous nights and were not as extreme as this one. So there's nothing unusual about the concept of landed craft, occupants seen outside of the craft. There's a book you can find called The Humanoids. And each chapter, it's an anthology of accounts from around the world, each chapter written by a noted UFO researcher from his or her country. And just as the title suggests, The Humanoids, the whole book, each chapter is about encounters with humanoids. And in that book, there are many accounts of landed craft, occupants seen outside of the craft. There was a huge UFO wave in 1954 in France. And many of the eyewitnesses, including police officers, saw the same thing, landed craft, beings outside of the craft. So what Larry Warren described is not even unusual in the annals of UFO literature and UFO research. Larry suffered retina burns, he suffered radiation poisoning. After a while, he was having blood seep out from his back. He and some of the others, after just one night and being around that landed craft, started to have a shock of white hair. He kind of likened it, if memory serves, to, if you remember watching the old Mel Gibson movies, Mad Max, and then The Road Warrior, and then, Thunderdome. over time, he decided he started to have in the series of movies, kind of like Salt and Pepper, a shock of white hair. And Larry Warren said, as a result of this encounter of that craft and the beings coming out of the craft, that final night, that last night in Rendlesham Forest, December 1980, this would have been right around Christmas time, that a number of the airmen that were out there and the officers that were out there, they started having issues with their hair. They had eye inflammation, radiation sickness. As a matter of fact, the disaster preparedness units from the air base were out there with the Geiger counters that were taking measurements from hotspots, radioactive hotspots. Now, before too long, hopefully it won't be that much longer from now, there will be a documentary that will be called Incident at Capel Green. The area where this landed craft and the occupants emerged from the landed craft outside of RAF Bentwaters, it's actually two bases side by side. RAF Bentwaters was the American base, and the point of relevance also is at the time, nobody knew it outside of military circles. RAF Bentwaters was one of the largest repositories of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, completely in violation of treaties they had with the British, the Americans had with the British at the time. That was a whole nother reason for the secrecy harassment of a lot of the witnesses, including Larry Warren. He was at one point on the surface shortly after this event. He was abducted on the surface along with Staff Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. They were drugged, taken underground into an underground base where, whether it was like a theater of the mind or whether it was for psychological warfare purposes, he was presented with a silhouette, with the being on the other side of the silhouette that was talking to him telepathically. And he doesn't know if it was a real alien or if it was just some kind of mind control they were exerting on him. But Larry has said, and I attended Larry's lecture in the early 1990s, his story hasn't varied, not at all. If anything, kind of like Bob Lazar, if anything, he may be holding stuff back. You never know. That's not to impugn his credibility in any way. I believe Larry 100%. But, I know from my own experience as an alien abductee, there's some things I just will not share, right? There's something I will hold back on until I get more information on it. And Larry was taken underground, and Larry made the point that nowadays, and he said this in the early 90s, everyone's talking about underground bases. But, I started talking about underground bases shortly after, he went public, right? So RAF Bentwaters was a repository of the largest repository of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe at that time. And in the previous nights, prior to Larry's experience, once again, eyewitnesses, military personnel, saw UFOs hovering right over the weapon storage areas and were beaming lights down into the weapon storage areas. Now, what the aliens told Herbert Schirmer, the aforementioned Herbert Schirmer, is they have a means to look into solid objects, by shooting some kind of light beam or ray or something into houses, into buildings, into structures, into hangars, they can see what's inside. So later on, when I read accounts of these craft shooting beams down into the weapon storage areas of various nuclear weapons bases, that's the first thing I thought of. They're using a sensor or something to determine, the yield of these weapons, what they're made out of, et cetera, et cetera. So that is an important case. There's Larry Warren right there. And the documentary that's going to be coming out will blow the lid off of all of this. It's going to, hopefully, this whole coronavirus thing will blow over eventually. And this documentary will come out. It will get the publicity it deserves because it's one of the most important cases out there because it has everything in it. Highly trained military personnel. Larry was an Air Force security policeman. He was trained in anti-terrorist measures. He was trained to guard nuclear weapons, basically. And the attacks on this guy, the never-ending attacks on this guy, how he's held up all this time is a testament to just how the strength of character. And also Larry is an abductee. He's had, long before he joined the Air Force, he was having alien abduction experiences. So I just want to tie all this together here. The radiological effects, the radiation poisoning, the after effects of close encounters with UFOs, whether we're talking about Army Reserve crewmen in a helicopter or we're talking about 3 women driving home from a restaurant late at night or whatever the case may be. Oftentimes, there are after effects. I know in my case, and I've spoken to many abductees, they've told me, and I believe because it's happened to me, that in the days and weeks after a UFO ET encounter, our psi abilities are amped up. They're amped up. They're stronger for a period of time. So I wanted to share this information with you people that attended the Preston lecture, because I believe, as Stephen and Evan believe, based on their discussions with the Aboriginal elders, that a lot of the ETs are coming back. Indeed, many of them never left. They've had permanent bases here, many of these different ET groups. But I do believe there's something to the notion that these Palladians, or at least groups of these Palladians, are not all the same, are coming back. Because if you follow the trends here on the surface, especially with this coronavirus, especially with all the restrictions and the lockdown and social distancing and all that, hopefully, I'm hoping that they start to ease off their restrictions and things can pretty much get back to normal. But in the meantime, they've destroyed countless businesses, countless livelihoods, millions of people unemployed all over the world. It's a case of the cure being worse than the disease, because the human race would have been able to ride out this coronavirus storm. That's even assuming that it's real as we understand it, right? For what it's worth, I believe there's something out there other than coronavirus. The coronavirus is what they keep harping about and hyping up and frightening everybody with. But it's quite possible there's something else out there besides that, which may be amplified or activated in some way by the 5G. So the point of relevance is, I think that we've reached a point now, folks, where the curtain is starting to rise on, I wouldn't say the final act, but there's a great revealing that's underway. And that's what the term apocalypse means, is a revealing. And what we're seeing on the surface with the coronavirus and the lockdown and all the rest, it is part of the malevolent alien agenda, because everything we're seeing is inhuman. The social distancing, the mistrust that's being fostered within everybody. Now all these people are dobbing in others for not maintaining the social distancing, or for hanging around too many other people, or having too many guests at their house. They've turned Australia and large parts of the world into a snitch society, a dobbing society, a narc society, as they would say in America, a snitch or narc. They fostered this mistrust. And to me, it's inhuman. That's why I know ultimately that malevolent aliens are behind this whole coronavirus thing. And if you read books like William Bramley's book, The Gods of Eden, he's come up with convincing, to me, evidence from medieval chronicles about how non-human beings may have been responsible for the Black Plague, in previous centuries, based on eyewitness accounts, who've seen what we would call UFOs flying over crop fields and spraying like powder or dust over them, or seeing humanoids in fields spraying like gaseous substances over crops. These are the stories that have come out of Europe in those days, when the different phases of the Black Plague, bubonic plague. So this wouldn't be a first if aliens, non-human life forms, were behind the coronavirus scare, right? Because anytime you have fear, anytime you have hyped up fear that lumps everyone, lodges a lot of people into the reptilian part of their brain, their survival brain, and they're very suggestible. Scared people will do what their authority figures tell them to do. So keep all that in mind, because I think as time goes on, we're already seeing manifestations of it. There's an upsurge, an uptick of UFO alien activity all over the world, and I expect that to continue. So anyway, thank you for sitting in on my lecture here. Sorry for my voice. When I talk too long sometimes my voice gets a little hoarse. But I hope what I shared with you today has some meaning, holds some meaning for you. And I want to thank Stephen and Evan Strong for giving me the opportunity to come on here and speak to you. And I hope one of these days, after all this blows over, to be able to speak before you again, in one of Stephen's conferences. Anyhow, I'm James Bartley. You can find my work on the CosmicSwitchboard.com. You can find me on Facebook, and you can find me on Twitter. And you can find me on my heavily censored YouTube channel under James Bartley. So wherever you may be, whatever you may be doing, have a very pleasant time, and I'll talk to you again. Bye for now.